In 1950, Venezuela had the fourth highest per capita income on Earth, higher than Germany, higher than Japan, higher than most of Western Europe. Venezuelans drove Cadillacs. They vacationed in Miami. They sent their children to study at Harvard and Oxford. The capital city of Caracas was called the Paris of South America. It had world-class architecture, glittering shopping districts, and a skyline that rivaled Manhattan. Venezuela was not just rich. It was fabulously, obscenely, impossibly rich. And the source of that wealth lay beneath its soil. Black gold, petroleum. Venezuela sat atop the largest proven oil reserves on the planet. 303 billion barrels. More than Saudi Arabia. More than Russia. More than Iraq and Iran combined. For decades, Venezuela was a model of prosperity in a continent plagued by poverty and instability. It was the exception, the success story, the proof that Latin America could produce a wealthy, functioning democracy. Now fast forward to today. The same country that once had the highest standard of living in South America now has the lowest. The economy has contracted by more than 80%. Inflation reached 1.7 million%. Not a typo, 1.7 million%. The average Venezuelan has lost 24 pounds in body weight due to lack of food. Hospitals have run out of medicine. Electricity and water are sporadic luxuries. 7 million people, 1/4 of the entire population, have fled the country. It is the largest refugee crisis in the history of the Western Hemisphere. How does a country with more oil than anyone else on Earth collapse into starvation? How does the richest nation in Latin America become its poorest? How does a success story become a horror story? This is not ancient history. This happened in our lifetime. This is happening right now. And the lessons of Venezuela's collapse are not just about one country. They are about what happens when governments make the same catastrophic mistakes that have destroyed economies throughout human history. Mistakes that echo in the policies of major economies today. This is the story of how oil wealth became oil curse, how abundance became dependency, and how the greatest natural resource blessing on the planet was transformed into an economic apocalypse that sent shockwaves around the world. The story begins in 1914 when a well called Zumac I struck oil in the Maracaibo Basin. But it was 1922 that changed everything. A well called Barroso II blew out and gushed 100,000 barrels per day for 9 days straight before it could be capped. The eruption could be seen from 40 miles away. The message was clear. Venezuela was sitting on an ocean of petroleum. By 1928, Venezuela had become the world's leading oil exporter. Foreign companies, primarily American and British, flooded into the country. Shell, Exxon, Gulf, Chevron. They built refineries. They built pipelines. They built company towns with swimming pools and air conditioning while most Venezuelans still lived without electricity. The foreign oil companies extracted the wealth. Venezuela got royalties. It was not a fair deal, but it was a deal that made the country rich by regional standards. Then came Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso. He was a lawyer, an economist, and the most important Venezuelan you have never heard of. In 1960, Perez Alfonso had a radical idea. If oil-producing countries banded together, they could control supply and dictate prices to the world. He traveled to Baghdad and convinced Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq, and Kuwait to join his vision. OPEC was born, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. Venezuela was a founding member, and Perez Alfonso was its intellectual father. The 1973 oil embargo proved the power of this cartel. Oil prices quadrupled. Money flooded into Venezuela like never before. President Carlos Andrés Perez nationalized the oil industry in 1976, creating PDVSA, Petróleos de Venezuela S.A. The state now owned the oil. And here is where the seeds of destruction were planted. PDVSA was designed to be independent from politics. It was run by technocrats, engineers, professionals. It reinvested profits. It maintained infrastructure. It planned for the future. In the 1990s, PDVSA was ranked among the most efficient oil companies in the world. It produced 3.5 million barrels per day. It was the crown jewel of Venezuelan industry. But there was a problem. Venezuela had become completely dependent on oil. By the 1990s, oil represented 95% of export earnings and 50% of government revenue. When oil prices were high, Venezuela was rich. When oil prices fell, Venezuela was in crisis. This is the Petro-State trap. When you have easy oil money, you do not need to build a diverse economy. You do not need efficient taxation. You do not need productive industries. You just pump oil and spend the revenue. Your currency strengthens, making all other exports uncompetitive. Your domestic manufacturing dies because it is cheaper to import everything. Your agriculture withers because farming cannot compete with oil wages. Venezuela became a country that produced almost nothing except petroleum. It imported food. It imported manufactured goods. It imported expertise. And it spent its oil revenue on massive government programs, subsidies, and public employment. The government became the economy. When oil prices collapsed in the 1980s, Venezuela's GDP fell by 25%. Poverty exploded. The middle class was devastated. Riots erupted in 1989, known as the Caracazo. Hundreds, possibly thousands, died. 2 coup attempts followed in 1992. The leader of one of those failed coups was a young military officer named Hugo Chavez. He was arrested, he was imprisoned, and he became a folk hero to millions of Venezuelans who blamed the traditional political class for their suffering. In 1998, Hugo Chavez won the presidential election in a landslide. He promised to break the corrupt elite. He promised to redistribute oil wealth to the poor. He promised a Bolivarian revolution that would transform not just Venezuela, but all of Latin America. He kept his promises, and in doing so, he set his country on the path to complete economic annihilation. Hugo Chavez was a master communicator. He hosted a weekly television show called Allo Presidente that ran for hours. He sang songs. He told jokes. He connected with ordinary Venezuelans in a way no previous leader had, and he genuinely believed he was on a mission to help the poor. In his first years, the results seemed miraculous. Oil prices began rising in 1999 and kept climbing through the 2000s, from $10 per barrel in 1998 to over $100 by 2008. Venezuela's oil revenue increased tenfold, and Chavez spent every dollar. He built housing projects. He funded health clinics. He imported Cuban doctors to provide free health care in slums. He created literacy programs, food subsidy programs, job training programs. Poverty rates dropped dramatically. Inequality fell. For the first time in generations, poor Venezuelans felt like the government was on their side. But the programs were funded entirely by oil revenue. There was no sustainable economic model, no productive investment, no diversification, just spending. And the spending created dependency. Millions of Venezuelans became reliant on government handouts that could only continue if oil prices stayed high. Then Chavez made the decision that would doom PDVSA. In 2002, PDVSA managers and workers went on strike, protesting Chavez's increasingly authoritarian control. Chavez responded by firing 18,000 employees. Not 18,000 workers from across the government. 18,000 employees from PDVSA specifically. These were the engineers, the geologists, the technicians, the people who actually knew how to extract, refine, and export oil. He replaced them with political loyalists, people whose qualification was loyalty to the revolution, not expertise in petroleum engineering. He redirected PDVSA's investment budgets to social programs. Maintenance was deferred. Exploration was cut. The reinvestment that had made PDVSA world-class simply stopped. Production began declining. In 2001, Venezuela produced 3.2 million barrels per day. By 2013, the year Chavez died, it had fallen to 2.8 million barrels per day. The decay was gradual. It was masked by high oil prices, but the rot had set in. Chavez also weaponized the economy against political opponents. Private businesses that criticized the government faced expropriation. Foreign companies were nationalized. Price controls were imposed on basic goods. Currency controls created a Byzantine system where government officials could buy dollars cheaply and sell them on the black market for massive profits. Corruption exploded. An estimated $300 billion was stolen from the Venezuelan state during the Chavez era. That is not a metaphor. Actual theft, documented fraud, money that disappeared into foreign bank accounts, Miami condos, and Spanish villas. The private sector was decimated. Productive businesses fled or closed. Employment shifted to the government sector. By 2012, the state controlled 60% of the economy. Everything depended on oil. Everything depended on Chavez. When Chavez died of cancer in March 2013, he left behind a hollow economy. Oil production was declining. Infrastructure was crumbling. The bureaucracy was bloated and corrupt. International reserves were depleted. And there was no plan for what would happen when oil prices eventually fell. His successor, Nicolas Maduro, was a former bus driver who had risen through union politics. He lacked Chavez's charisma, his political instincts, and his ability to maintain order. He inherited a time bomb. In 2014, the bomb exploded. Oil prices began falling in mid-2014. From over $100 per barrel, they crashed to below $30 by early 2016. This was devastating for any oil-dependent economy. For Venezuela, which depended on oil for 95% of its export revenue, it was an extinction event. The government faced a simple math problem. Its social programs cost billions of dollars. Its oil revenue had collapsed by 75%. There was no other significant source of income, no diversified economy to fall back on, no reserves to cushion the blow. What do? The Maduro government made the choice that has destroyed economies throughout history. They printed money. When you cannot pay your bills with revenue, you can print currency and pay with that. The problem is that printing money does not create real value. It just dilutes the value of existing money. Prices rise. The currency falls. You need to print more money to pay the higher prices, which causes prices to rise further, which requires more printing. It is a doom loop that has destroyed the German mark, the Zimbabwean dollar, and countless other currencies. Venezuela's inflation began accelerating in 2015. By 2016, it hit 800%. By 2017, it exceeded 2,000%. By 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated inflation at 1.7 million%. The bolivar became worthless faster than it could be printed. Let me tell you what this looked like on the ground. A Venezuelan worker named Maria earned 30,000 bolivars per day in 2017. That was enough to buy 3 eggs. The next week, the same 30,000 bolivars would only buy 2 eggs. The week after that, 1 egg. Workers demanded to be paid daily because money lost value by the hour. People stopped keeping cash at all. They spent their wages immediately on whatever they could find before prices rose again. Supermarket shelves emptied. The government had imposed price controls that made selling goods unprofitable. Producers stopped producing. Importers stopped importing. A country that imported 70% of its food could no longer afford to buy it. The scenes from Venezuelan hospitals became international news. Patients lying on floors without mattresses, doctors performing surgery by flashlight during blackouts, newborns dying in incubators that no longer had electricity. Medicines that cost pennies in other countries became impossible to find. Venezuelans died from diseases that had been eliminated decades ago. Malaria returned. Measles spread. Diphtheria killed children who would have been saved by a simple vaccination. The murder rate in Caracas exceeded 100 per 100,000 people. For comparison, the murder rate in New York City is around 3 per 100,000. Venezuela became one of the most dangerous places on Earth, not because of drug cartels or civil war, but because of economic collapse. When people are starving, when police are not paid, when the social contract disintegrates, violence fills the vacuum. Then came the exodus. Venezuelans began leaving, first in a trickle, then a flood, then a tsunami. By 2019, over 4 million had fled. By 2023, that number exceeded 7 million. 1/4 of the entire population. They walked across borders into Colombia. They crammed into buses bound for Peru. They boarded boats for Caribbean islands. They scattered across the entire Western Hemisphere. This was not immigration. This was refugees fleeing catastrophe. Doctors, engineers, teachers, entire families walking for days with children on their shoulders. It was the largest displacement of people in the history of the Americas. And what happened to the oil? PDVSA's production collapsed alongside the economy. Remember, the skilled workers had been fired. The infrastructure had been neglected for 15 years. The equipment was failing. The refineries were breaking down. In 2019, Venezuela produced just 700,000 barrels per day, down from 3.5 million at the peak. A country with the largest oil reserves on Earth could barely produce enough to meet its own domestic needs. International sanctions, first from the Obama administration and escalated dramatically under Trump, cut Venezuela off from the global financial system. PDVSA could not sell oil to the United States, its traditional largest customer. It could not access U.S. dollars. It could not buy replacement parts for American-made equipment. The sanctions did not cause the collapse. The collapse was well underway before sanctions began, but they accelerated the death spiral. You might be thinking this is a tragic but distant story, a failure of one country with one corrupt government. But the collapse of Venezuelan oil production sent shockwaves through global energy markets that affected prices in every country on Earth. In 2015, Venezuela was producing 2.5 million barrels per day. By 2020, it was producing 400,000 barrels per day. That is 2 million barrels per day that vanished from global markets. At $70 per barrel, that is $51 billion per year in oil that no longer exists. When supply decreases and demand stays constant, prices rise. Venezuelan production collapse contributed to the oil price recovery from 2016 onward. When you paid more at the gas pump in 2018 or 2022, part of that increase traced directly back to the destruction of PDVSA. But the financial implications extended beyond energy. Venezuela defaulted on its international bonds. It owed over $150 billion to foreign creditors. China alone had lent Venezuela approximately $65 billion. Russia had lent billions more. These debts will likely never be fully repaid. International investors who had bought Venezuelan bonds suffered massive losses. Funds that had exposure to emerging market debt saw their returns hammered. The refugee crisis strained neighboring economies. Colombia absorbed over 2 million Venezuelan migrants. Peru took 1.5 million. Ecuador, Chile, Brazil, Argentina all faced sudden population influxes that stressed housing, healthcare, and labor markets. The humanitarian cost continues to this day. And here is the part that should truly concern anyone paying attention. Venezuela's collapse is not unique. It is a case study in how a Petro-State can destroy itself through economic mismanagement. But the underlying pattern, a government spending more than it earns, printing money to cover the gap, destroying productive capacity through political interference, this pattern exists elsewhere. Argentina has experienced similar cycles of boom and bust. Turkey's lira has collapsed multiple times. Sri Lanka defaulted in 2022. Pakistan teeters on the edge. Even major developed economies are running massive deficits, financed by central bank money creation. The difference is scale and speed. Venezuela went from crisis to catastrophe in about 5 years. A larger economy with more diversification might take longer. But the fundamental math does not change. If you spend more than you produce, if you print money to cover the difference, if you destroy productive capacity, the end result is always the same. Venezuela's oil collapse is not just an economic story. It is a human tragedy of almost incomprehensible scale. 7 million people displaced, millions more trapped in poverty, a generation of children growing up malnourished, doctors and engineers driving taxis in foreign countries because their education became worthless in a collapsed economy. The country with the most oil on earth now cannot keep the lights on. The warnings were there. Economists predicted exactly what would happen. The pattern had played out in other Petro-States. The signs of decay were visible for a decade before the crash. But the government did not listen. The population, lulled by years of free programs and easy oil money, did not force change. And by the time the collapse became undeniable, it was too late to stop. Hugo Chavez once declared that he would use oil wealth to build a socialist utopia. Instead, he and his successor built a cautionary tale that will be studied for generations. What is the lesson? Perhaps it is that natural resources are not wealth. They are only wealth if they are managed well. Perhaps it is that no country is too rich to destroy itself through bad policy. Perhaps it is that economic fundamentals cannot be cheated forever, no matter how much money you print. Or perhaps the lesson is simpler. When you see a government spending money, it does not have attacking the productive capacity of its economy, making promises that cannot be mathematically sustained. Pay attention, because the people of Venezuela did not think it could happen to them either. They were wrong, and the wreckage of their country stands as a monument to the consequences of ignoring economic reality. The Paris of South America is now a cautionary tale. The richest nation in Latin America is now the poorest. The country with the most oil on earth is a country where people are starving. History does not repeat, but it rhymes. The patterns of Venezuela's collapse echo in policies being implemented in capitals around the world today. The question is whether we will learn from this tragedy or whether we will repeat it. The clock is always ticking.